Luke 15. So, forewarning. We're going to dive a little bit deeper this morning than maybe we typically do. So, hopefully I won't lose you. Stay with me. It's going to come together at the end. Hopefully, I think. Guess you'll be the judge of that, not me per se. So, we all have some things that we have trouble wrapping our minds around, don't we? For some of us, we potentially, or maybe all of us, I suppose, we have a little bit of difficulty. Can anybody wrap their mind around quantum mechanics? Anybody know the ins and outs of string theory? No? Okay. Maybe for some of us, it's a little bit things that are a little bit more simpler. Simple. You know how we're on a sphere that we live on called Earth, and it spins very, very fast, and yet we don't fly off of it. We stand and sit and don't feel like we're spinning. At least I hope not, anyway. But, yeah, the water doesn't move unless we move it. The water on the earth doesn't fly off. How does all this work? Gravity working to hold us and all these things. I mean, you think about that for a little bit, it's going to be pretty tricky to wrap your mind around how just that simple thing works. For some of us, it's hard to wrap our minds around how time, at sometimes, just flies along. And then at other times, like on Sunday mornings at about 11:30, time just seems to crawl for a long time. For the Christian, one of our great challenges, one of the difficulties we face is wrapping our minds around grace, God's grace. How could God show grace to us when He was not required to show grace at all? And we were most certainly undeserving of grace. Now, I suppose it's possible you could be one of those rare people that you can understand why God would show grace to you, but not that person. Maybe you're one of those rare people. Maybe those considerations, maybe you don't have difficulties wrapping your head around that. That's possible, but maybe this one will hit home with you a little closer. Wrapping our minds around showing grace to others. That is potentially even more difficult than understanding God's grace. I read on Twitter this morning a quote from a man by the name of Scotty Smith, who I don't know, but he said this. He said, "A sign you're growing in grace is that your default mode is to extend the benefit of the doubt rather than seize a chance to judge." In other words, you have the opportunity to judge someone, but instead you choose to show them grace. So within those thoughts this morning, I'd like us, and that's where I intend to lay the thrust of the message in this passage together. Hopefully, all of this together will lead us to this conclusion, and that is this. The scribes and Pharisees misunderstood the purpose of the Messiah. Therefore, they misunderstood the love of Jesus shown towards sinners. Therefore, in their self-righteousness, they murmured and complained about the grace that was shown to the sinners, not realizing that grace was available for them also. Now, we got to back up, and sorry for a longer introduction, but we got to back up a little bit to understand as we're coming into this passage. So if you go back to chapter 14 and recall with me, that it told us at the beginning of chapter 14, there was a large group of people that was following Jesus. And of that large group of people, Jesus then talks to them and tells them, if you want to come follow me, you have to be willing to do what? Give up everything, potentially even including your life. to follow me. That's the cost of following me. So he invites them. You want to follow me? You can do so, but it's going to cost you. Then when we come to chapter 15 and verse 1, we're told that then the tax collectors, the publicans, and sinners drew near to Jesus to hear him. So he tells them, hey, it's going to cost you everything. And two groups of people, tax collectors and sinners, gather in close to Jesus. Now, it's not that the tax collectors were not sinners. They were sinners. But in the religious elite's mind, the tax collectors were just a little bit worse of sinners than the sinners in general, because they were Jews, but they were also working for the enemy. And so that made them just a little bit worse than, just your everyday average sinner. In response to these two groups of people drawing near to Jesus, the scribes and the Pharisees said this. They murmured, they complained, they said, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." Can you hear the judgment in that? Can you hear the lack of grace in that? This man says he's the Messiah. This man, remember all the way back to Luke chapter 4. I know we go back there all the time, but this man said he's the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. He says he's the Messiah, but he's entertaining those people? In response to the Pharisees and the scribes, Jesus tells 3 parables. And all 3 of those parables here in Luke 15, really they explained that the Messiah was not going to follow the religious culture's norms of what they said the Messiah should do. No, he was going to go after the lost sheep. He was going to go find the lost coin. Not because the coin had tremendous value. It was valuable. The coin was definitely valuable. But because to her, to the woman, to Jesus, the Messiah, the coin was of priceless value. And then he tells the 3rd parable, the longest one, verses 11 down through 32. He says, there's a man who had 2 sons. He proceeds to tell us about the younger son. Then he tells us about the father, and today we'll look at the older son. Now, the man in the story is none other than God the Father himself. As we saw 2 weeks ago, the way the father responds to a wayward child coming home is with great forgiveness and grace. The younger son that we looked at 3 weeks ago, we saw he was a picture of really all people in general at some point or another. Either we were the younger son or we are the younger son, one way or another. But, that being said, the main thrust of the prodigal son parable, if you will, the main thrust of that is not about the younger son, though that's how we title it. The main thrust is actually not even the father. Though the father's a big part of it, obviously, and the father pictures for us a phenomenal, an amazing picture of God our Father. But really the thrust is not even the father. The main thrust of the parable is the elder brother. Because that's who Jesus is talking about. That's why Jesus is telling this parable, to respond to the scribes and Pharisees and what they said. I call him the prodigal brother in this case, because what the prodigal brother was doing is he was spending every ounce of his energy. He was spending everything trying to earn the Father's grace. But he actually had the Father's grace all along. And hopefully we'll see that as we work through. So if you're there in Luke 15, sorry again for the long introduction, we'll read Luke 15 verses 25 down through verse 32. Now his elder son was in the field. And as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. He was angry and would not go in. Therefore his father came out and entreated him. And he answered and said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment. Yet thou never gavest me a kid. that I might make merry with my friends? But as soon as this thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed him, or killed for him, sorry, that's not how it went. Thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. And the father said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found. Quite an impressive story all around. I suspect, many of us suspect, it's actually a real story, in some parts at least. But either way, we're told that the father, without reservation, throws a party for his son. Now, if you remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about how this was antithetical to the culture of that day. That's not what they would do. No one in that culture would have recommended this treatment. In fact, they would have recommended you treat the son as an outcast. He's an outcast forever. Yeah, you can welcome him back into your home, but only as a slave. He's never entitled to be treated as a son again. He will never, ever, ever be restored to his status as a son. But not so in God's family. No, in God's family, when the lost are found, when the dead are made alive, they are welcomed back in with the embrace of the Father, with the kiss of forgiveness, as we saw. And then the Father restores the status of the Son. He puts the signet ring on his finger. He puts shoes on his feet. He gives him the robe of honor, the place of honor. Prepares the fatted calf. Gathered musicians, apparently. And clearly, he got enough guests there that would celebrate and dance with them. And at this point in the story, John Phillips said it this way. He said, we might well pause here and look at the publicans and sinners, how they must have smiled, thinking about this story. And the scribes and Pharisees, how they must have scowled. But the Lord did not stop. The story was not yet over. The half had not been told because there was another son, a sanctimonious older son. Number one, I'd like us to look at an episode of resentment that reveals the challenge of embracing grace. An episode of resentment that reveals the challenge of embracing grace. Verse 25 again said, Now the elder son, his elder son, was in the field, and as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing, and he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. Now, we don't have time frames exactly on how all this panned out. Obviously, this seemed to have taken some time because you had to kill and butcher the calf, and you had to prepare it and cook it and all that goes into that. He had to find musicians. He had to get people to come and guests to come. So it's taken a little bit of time, maybe a full afternoon or more. And the father's servants, while they're busy serving the guest and doing all this, they are also alert and watching for the other brother to come home. And as he does, he comes home and he hears music and dancing. Not what he was expecting to hear. So he calls one of these waiting servants and he asks them and inquires as to why did this happen? And the servant responds with a story. A short story, but a story of redemption. A story of wonderful love. A story, as the song says, of a sinner saved by grace. Or as the other song says, redeemed through the Father's infinite mercy, his child and forever I am. Good news, right? But verse 28 tells us he was angry. Therefore his father came out and entreated him, and he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee. Neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment, and yet thou never gavest me a kid. that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this thy son was come, which has devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. We understand through these words, the elder brother hated the younger brother. Partially because the younger brother had left. Partially because the younger brother had taken part of the father's inheritance. So the way compound interest works, if he hadn't taken that portion, probably the older brother's portion would have been bigger in the long run than what it ended up being. But really, the hate he has for his younger brother is revealed in that he hated his younger brother for coming home. Because if only his younger brother had stayed away, if only he didn't come home, then maybe someday my father will recognize that I have been the perfect son. I've never transgressed his commandments. Any desire my father desired, I was there to fulfill it. But his father never threw a party for him. His father never made him the guest of honor. Apparently, the younger son's escapades had made their way back to home. And really what this son does, the older son does, is he accuses his father of being unjust and unfair. Your wicked son, not my brother, your son, comes back here, grovels at your feet, says, "Make me your slave," and instead you put the ring back on his finger. Now I have to be associated with him for the rest of my life, even though everybody knows all the things he's done. You elevate him back to his status. You elevate him above his status. You put a guest of honor robe on him. Now you throw a party for him? You kill the fatted calf? Music, dancing, a party that he's come home? And yet for me, you have done nothing. The story is told of a doctor who was known as being the most wicked man in the most wicked city in England. On his deathbed, a minister arrived and spoke with him, and before his passing, the minister was able to lead the doctor to Christ. Word was spread about this, and another minister in the town was indignant. He could not understand why this man who lived his life so wickedly was allowed to escape punishment through a deathbed confession. It's recorded that he asked his friend this: "Do you think a deathbed confession atones for a whole life of sin?" To which his friend responded and said, "No, it doesn't, but Calvary does." See, the unfortunate reality is this: even in the middle of serving faithfully the King of Kings, our hearts can harbor resentment, dissatisfaction, anger, bitterness. And when we allow that to happen, what we're really doing is robbing ourselves of the joy of embracing God's grace, not only in our own lives, but the grace of God that we see for every person in every circumstance of life. And it's not necessarily exclusively just for the grace of salvation. It's also for God's grace throughout our lives, the everyday grace we get in our lives. So maybe some examples of how this would happen would be this. For the pastor, it's that he sees God is seemingly blessing another person's ministry, but he doesn't seem to be blessing my ministry. Or maybe for a father, it's this: I can see that that person's children are successful and they're doing well, but look at how bad my children turned out, etc. Maybe for a mother, it could be this: I see how that mother has everything and all together. She's got 1 million kids. Everything's always put together and perfect. And yet I have one child and I can barely breathe. Maybe for a man, it could be, well, God seems to bless every other man with a wife, but he's not given me a wife. Or maybe it's this. He's in regards to the work area for anyone. I have all this education, I have all this knowledge, I have all this experience, but I'm over here making pennies, and meanwhile, that guy over there who's not gone to college, doesn't done any of that stuff, he's making 5 times as much as me. Maybe it could be that for a woman, it's God allows that person to have so many kids, and yet I sit here with none. And God knows I desire a child so much. See, the situations we could explain are endless. But the problem is, in every scenario, the problem becomes resentment and bitterness, anger that is allowed to fester and grow in our hearts. And that anger eats away at our ability to have and experience and be joyful in seeing God's grace on display in other people's lives. So number 1, an episode of resentment that reveals the challenge of embracing grace. But number 2, a moment of explanation that reveals the availability of unconditional grace. In verse 31, the father responds, and he says to his son, "Thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad. For this thy brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found." The elder brother could not join in the celebration because he could not comprehend how his father could show his brother grace even after all he had done to tarnish his father's good and great name. But what the older son forgot was that he had received the same grace of the Father, just in a different way. So picture it this way. He'd received the grace of his Father over his whole life. His son had been gone this whole time, and now all that grace of the Father is poured out in one moment, if you will. So you got 2 pictures. Both got the Father's grace. One got it at this time, one got it at this time. Now here's the picture. The scribes and Pharisees could not accept that Jesus would entertain publicans and sinners and allow them to be his followers, because they could not comprehend how God could show these people grace even after all the public sins and the sins everybody knew about them. But what the scribes and Pharisees forgot was this: they were being offered the same grace of the Messiah. And because of their advanced religious knowledge, if you will, they would get to experience it in a different way. In other words, they grew up in church, if you will. They grew up knowing all these things about God. They grew up having all this vast religious knowledge, and so they experienced God's grace over a long span of time, whereas these sinners and these publicans coming into the Messiah and finding grace with the Messiah are experiencing God's grace not over a long time, but a lot of it in a very quick amount of time, if you will. And the problem that the elder brother faced, and the problem that the Pharisees and scribes faced that they didn't quite get, was this. They thought the long period of time that they had done was going to earn them a large amount of grace at one period of time. They thought this: grace will be earned because I'm serving God. But grace is not earned by our service. The older son, through his years of faithful service to the father, thought, well, this will earn me the accolades of my father. One of these days, my father will kill the fatted calf for me, and finally I will have made it. Not realizing all along he had received the accolades of his father, and he had access to the grace of his father. The scribes and the Pharisees thought this: we've spent all our lives serving in the synagogues. We have this vastly superior biblical knowledge to anyone and everybody else, and that should earn us the exclusive right to God's grace. When in reality, God's grace was available for everybody all along. Maybe this combination of quotes from David Guzik and G. Campbell Morgan is this: there was a sense in which the older son was obedient, yet far from his father's heart. Wyatt, please don't do that. In this sense, He was a perfect illustration of the religious leaders who were angry that Jesus received tax collectors and sinners. And G. Campbell Morgan said this: his story reveals the possibility of living in the Father's house and failing to understand the Father's heart. These scribes and Pharisees, they lived in the Father's house. They had all this knowledge of what the Old Testament scriptures said, and yet when the Messiah came, they didn't see him. And thus, we arrive at the crux of the problem, this idea I gave you earlier. They misunderstood the purpose of the Messiah. Therefore, when they see the love of Jesus being shown towards sinners, in that he would entertain and have grace towards sinners and tax collectors of all people, they didn't understand it. It welled up in them a self-righteousness and anger in them, and they said, "How dare you entertain publicans, eat with publicans and sinners?" And what they failed to realize was Jesus was offering the same grace to them. Now, here's where we're going to get a bit deeper, if that wasn't deep enough for you. And it'll seem like we're taking a left turn, but we'll come back, I hope. The Messiah, Jesus, did not come to cast out Israel. Israel was God's chosen nation to bring the Messiah into the world. Now, this is all connected, if you remember back into the messages through chapters 14, back in 13 and 12, and how he gave all these descriptions of the vine and the branches and Israel being outside but seeing people inside. So all this is connected all the way through. Somewhere along the way, however, religious leaders in Israel stole this part, that we are God's chosen nation. But they left off the part that we're God's chosen nation to bring the Messiah into the world. Instead, they elevated themselves and said, we're God's chosen nation. Phooey on all you other people. Therefore, when we get to Luke 15, there's generations removed from the beginning of this teaching. And so these scribes and Pharisees that Jesus are now dealing with have only viewed the scripture through the lens that we are a special people. Nobody else is. We religious people are better than all the other people, even other Jews. Yeah, okay, but we're better than all of them. And what Jesus was trying to get them to realize, he's trying to reveal to them this: you have not been chosen to the exclusion of all others. You've been chosen for the inclusion of all others. See, they had a very special honor, but it wasn't the honor that they thought it was. We don't know how the conclusion of this parable comes. And I believe Jesus intentionally leaves off the ending on a lot of parables, intentionally, to force his audience to make a choice. Are we going to have ears to hear? Are we going to have eyes to see? Or are we going to close our ears and close our eyes and blind ourselves? And then when they've done that, they stumble over Jesus. And if we fast forward to the end of the story here in a couple chapters, what we will find and what we will realize is that Jesus' death comes at the hands of who? The Israelites, the scribes, the Pharisees, the lawyers, the Sadducees. They were all leading the charge to crucify Jesus. And so this parable may have changed a few people's mind, but the vast majority of the scribes and Pharisees heard this parable and did nothing with it. Yep. The Messiah had not come to exclude them. He didn't come to push out the scribes and the Pharisees. He came to say, yeah, you're in my house. Great. Now let's invite the tax collectors and the sinners in too. It's not just for you guys, it's for everybody. But when they chose to be hard-hearted, when they chose to reject the Messiah, they were choosing to be excluded. Now, Paul goes at this in great length in Romans. And he says at the first part of Romans chapter 10, he says, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge." Even today, we still see it. The Israelite people, the Jewish people, they have a zeal for God. They're looking for the Messiah. They're waiting for the Messiah to come, but they already missed him. So they have a zeal, but it's not according to the truth. It goes on and says, "For they being ignorant of God's righteousness, in seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God." You see the elder brother syndrome here? They're trying to earn God's grace. They're trying to establish, hey, God, we're righteous. We're doing these sacrifices, and we're doing this, and we're doing this, and we're keeping the law, and we're doing all these things, not realizing they've missed real righteousness, God's righteousness. Who's that righteousness found in? In verse 4, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." Now, we're not going to cover every verse through Romans because, we can spend a long time in Romans understanding all these. But we're going to blaze through Romans 11 with some thoughts along the way. He says this, he says, "I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham and of the tribe of Benjamin." And then he says in verse 2, "God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew." He then skip down in verse 5. He says, "Even so then, at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace." In other words, there are still some, right now in Paul's day, there are still some Jews that believe in Jesus and accept the Father's grace. Paul himself being one of those. And then he says in verse 6, "And if by grace," in other words, if they're saved by grace, "then it is no longer of works, otherwise grace is no longer grace. But if it is of works, it is no longer grace, otherwise work is no longer work." What then? Israel has not obtained what it seeks, but the elect have obtained it, and the rest were blinded. In other words, Israel, what were they doing? They were looking for the Messiah. They're looking for salvation. They're waiting for the Messiah to come. But they didn't obtain it when the Messiah came. And therefore, what happened? They missed the Messiah. Therefore, the elect, those that believe, those that have placed their faith in God, they found the salvation that Israel was looking for. And the rest are what? Blinded. He even clarifies it in verse 8. "Just as it is written, God has given them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, to this very day." In other words, they chose to be hard-hearted, and God said, "Okay, if that's what you want, go ahead. I'll give it to you." He then says, though, in verse 8, "I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles." In other words, it says, when the Jews rejected Jesus, did they reject him so far that they can never be saved? No. No. But since they did, since they have fallen and they did reject the Messiah. What that should do, now that the door's open for all the Gentiles to be saved, and they can see all these Gentiles coming to the knowledge and faith of Jesus Christ and being the church of God, that should provoke the Jews to jealousy. Hey, those people got what we were looking for. We wanted the Messiah. We were looking to obtain the salvation of the Messiah. They got it and we don't. So it should be a jealousy that they have to go get that thing. Now, he says down in verse 17, I know we're skipping verses here, and I'm skipping them on purpose because there's a lot more we could go into, but he says in verse 17, returning to the example of the olive tree, the branches, the vine, the vineyard. If some of the branches were broken off, And you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them become a partaker of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. So, what is the root and the fatness of the olive tree? God. The kingdom of God. The church. All of that is the olive tree, if you will. And some of the branches, Israel, were broken off. But you, the wild olive tree, in other words, Romans, that's who he's writing to, the church at Rome, which would have been Gentile people. So they were grafted into the true church, if you will, while some of the branches, Israel, had been broken off. And then he warns them in verse 8, do not boast against the branches, but if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root supports you. In other words, let me continue. You will say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said, because of unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. So, don't boast, hey, Israel got chopped off, Israel was broken off, so that way we could be saved. We're better than Israel. No. That is not at all what he was trying to get at. He says, no, don't raise yourself up on a pedestal. No, don't be haughty, but instead fear God. Because then, in verse 21, he says this, for if God did not spare the natural branches, Israel, he may not spare you either. So don't get so caught up in, hey, we're so much worthy of being grafted into the tree, we're better than Israel, or else, hey, you might just get cut off too. Therefore, he says in verse 22, consider the goodness and severity of God. On those who fell, severity, but toward you, goodness. If you continue in his goodness, otherwise you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. Then his conclusion in verses 30 and 31. For as you were once disobedient to God, yet now have obtained mercy through their disobedience. Even so, these also have now been disobedient, that through the mercy shown you, they also may obtain mercy. So what is all that supposed to mean? Why am I going into all that length in Romans and everything to say this? Israel, the scribes, the Pharisees, that came against Jesus in verses 1 and 2 of Luke chapter 15 for eating with sinners and publicans. They were the elder brother in the story. That's who Jesus was directing it to. As a picture, after Jesus' death and resurrection, Israel as a whole is a picture of the elder brother. But in this example, we haven't gotten to that stage yet. But the good news that Romans tells us is this. Just like the younger son did not have to stay in the pigsty. There at the bottom of the barrel, in the pigsty, the younger son, what? He came to himself and said, I don't have to stay here. I can go back home. I can become a slave in my father's house. I don't have to stay here. Well, here's the thing. The scribes and the Pharisees, the elder brother, did not have to stay outside the party. He didn't have to stay on the outside. He didn't have to stay angry. He didn't have to continually be resentful in his heart toward his younger brother. He could just go inside. He could recognize, God the Father, my Father, has given me grace over my entire lifetime. Nothing withheld from me. And as Paul said, if they don't continue in their unbelief, they'll be grafted back in. In other words, Israel still today, if they will turn to Jesus and believe, grafted right back in. God's grace is for everyone, including the faithful who remain by his side. God's grace is unconditional in that you do not have to spend your whole life in service to him before he will extend his grace to you. You don't have to do all this stuff. You don't have to do all these things. No. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you'll be saved. Grace like that. Grace as quick as the younger son got it. This passage, altogether, reflects the inclusive nature of Christ's message, which is this. an invitation to all, not just wayward younger sons, but also wayward older sons, to partake in God's grace and forgiveness. And so the question would be then, how do we partake in God's grace? And then we fall all the way back to chapter 14 again, which is this: continued devotion to Jesus. Giving up everything to follow Jesus, potentially even including your own life. Why would we do that then? Because Jesus is the embodiment of God's grace and mercy, in that he reaches out to both the sinner and the scribe, the publican and the Pharisee. So I know that's a lot of deep information and knowledge, so if it went over your head, fine. Let me give you some practical or simple applications. First one, embrace God's grace. You could be the younger son who we dealt with a few weeks ago, living as though my father doesn't exist anymore, I'm on my own, I have everything I want to have, I can do whatever I want, go where I want to go, and everything else. But eventually the famine comes, eventually everything runs out, eventually you find yourself in the pigsty, and the good news is, if you come home to the Father will do what? Embrace you, kiss you with the kiss of forgiveness, welcome you home. However, within the passage before us today, it's potential somebody here could be like the older brother. You live a life outwardly that says, I'm on the Father's side. I've been serving the Father my whole life. I've been doing everything for the Father, any desire of the Father. Not once have I transgressed your commandments. And yet, in reality, you've never really taken him up on his offer of grace, or you never realized his offer of grace. The good news is, if you'll embrace God's grace will embrace you. Application number 2, extend God's grace. Say, I've already embraced God's grace. Fantastic. There is an unfortunate tendency within us to become judgmental, self-righteous, thinking we've got God's grace, and so now we're going to gatekeep who can come into God's grace and who can't come into God's grace. Therefore, it is essential and vital that we do what God was calling, why Jesus left this open-ended, that the scribes and Pharisees would, get to thinking about, hey, oh, that's us? Well, it's essential for us as Christians to stop every now and then and examine our own hearts and to ensure there's no elder brother syndrome, if you will, milling about in our hearts, causing us to be angry. It's possible we've seen and received God's grace over a long period of time, and we look at new people coming into faith, and we see God's grace seeming to be poured out on them in one split moment, and we can say, why is God giving them so much grace? He should give me more grace. Why didn't I get that when I got saved? Why didn't I get X, Y, and Z? And as we've examined our hearts and considered those thoughts and ensured that there's no elder brother syndrome in our midst, then we should extend God's grace. And if there is elder brother syndrome in our hearts, one of the best ways, I believe, to get rid of elder brother syndrome is extend God's grace. If you're upset about God's grace being extended to so-and-so, well, just go extending God's grace and you'll be amazed at how it's resolved. But we should extend God's grace through following Jesus. We are to be the metaphorical hands or the arms of Jesus, extending God's grace to all people, not just those ones that we deem worthy of God's grace. So the encouragement today, search your heart and ensure that your heart aligns with the heart of the Father. Let's pray.